Now, let's head over to Zimbabwe. The depressed economy there has resulted in tax collections that were 6% under target for the first half of the year. From January to June, taxes collected amounted to $1.65 billion. That's well below the projected figure of $1.75 billion. Company taxes down 13% at $145 million. Mining companies paying only $33 million in royalties. That's well below the targeted figure of $52 million. Mines, of course, have been struggling with low commodity prices and earnings, therefore. ZIMRA was owed $2.63 billion in outstanding taxes for the first half of the year. Now, the funds collected from taxes finance all of Zimbabwe's budget. You see, international lenders like the International Monetary Fund, the African Development Bank and the World Bank will only resume financial support to the Southern African nation after it has cleared its debt. Let's figure out exactly where the country goes from here. Takunda Mugaga is the CEO of the Zimbabwe National Chamber of Commerce. He's live in Harare right now. Mr. Mugaga, thank you very much for your time this evening. Company taxes, let's start with that. 13% below target. How did the other tax categories perform, and how did income tax specifically fare, given the cash shortages and the general slow growth we've been seeing in Zimbabwe?
Oh, thank you very much. Generally, if you look at the position at the moment, indeed it's true that Zimbabwe's economy is on a fiscal cliff edge. If you look at most of the indices, they have been facing southwards. You look at the corporate tax, you look at the individual tax, you're looking at the same time period, 2015 versus 2016, figures are not quite very promising. But maybe dwelling and getting much into the figures, especially from a corporate tax perspective, one can certainly conclude that the rate at which Zimbabwe economy has been informalizing is quite very alarming, and at the same time a distasteful element to any politician or any minister within the government. So generally, I think what should be the case, especially for Zimbabwe politicians, is to find ways somehow to formalize the Zimbabwean economy, knowing very well that the number of those who are formally employed are less than 300,000 in the private sector, with the government being the biggest employer, and figures where government is dominating in terms of the employment book are not quite held. They have a tendency of crowding out, especially resources within the economy. And if you look at most of the figures, especially from the fiscal side, one can certainly conclude to say the GDP growth downward revision from around 2.7% for 2016 to an average of about 4.5% is justified by a slowdown, especially in the figures, the tax figures from the tax authorities within Zimbabwe.
Indeed. The tax authorities, ZIMRA specifically, they say they're owed $2.63 billion, and that's outstanding taxes so far this year. Is all of that due from private companies?
Well, not necessarily. If you look at the breakdown of the figures, you realize that, yes, the private sector is the dominant component on the tax debt, contributing almost the same 5%, government about 12% through the parameters, and the other percentage coming from the other sectors. But generally, you realize that one area is business we had been quite complaining about in Zimbabwe is to do with the payout scheduling system within the whole tax administration system. If you look, you realize that for any failure to pay tax in time, the payout of 100% is quite very damaging. It's quite very disastrous for businesses, especially in such a harsh economic environment. If you could make a comparison, for example, with our regional southern neighbors, that's South Africa. The penal tax rate in South Africa is about 10% today, compared to about 100% in Zimbabwe. So all these factors, you realize that they will somehow push a figure, the 2.4, 2.5 billion tax debt. You shouldn't look at it from just that angle. Sometimes you realize there are other areas which are causing the tax debt to balloon. The unfriendly tax environment is one area we are pushing the government somehow to seriously look at if we are to somehow improve our rankings in terms of ease of doing business in the country.
Indeed. Actually, you've mentioned something that I would like to cover here. Serious cash flow problems on the government side, and the economy as a whole has broadly been shrinking. Do you see the government actually stepping back and saying, okay, unemployment is going up, obviously tax collections are nowhere near we need to be, and are they going to adjust the budget in order to reflect that? And at the same time, will they perhaps give companies, members of the Chamber of Commerce, tax breaks that they need in order to start growing and jumpstart growth?
Well, I think it's neither here nor there, but the fact of the matter is we are on the same page with the government of Zimbabwe in terms of the lethargic performance of the Zim economy. Yes, of late it could be equated to a walking textbook of pathology, where you know very well it's either the head the head, which is just troubling one. It's either the leg, which is a challenge. So the simple fact that the economy of Zimbabwe has not been growing at a rate which will lead to microeconomic transformation. Poverty levels, yes, they are still quite high. And the interest rate, the cost of borrowing in the country are still high. But sometimes we also try in all means, rather, to engage the Bretton Woods institutions, especially the IMF, somehow to find a way to help us in clearing the 1.8 billion debt. Because given the nature and the size of the budget, surely if Zimbabwe had managed to collect total revenue of about 1.65 billion to date from January of this year up to date, and we have to own up an obligation of about 1.8 billion in terms of arrears to the IMF, then the million-dollar question is Zimbabwe prepared? Does it have the capacity to clear such a 1.8 billion debt? Without the capacity, I think we need to relook at it with the IMF restructuring the relationship, because the never-ending standoff, especially between Harare, Washington, and London, where you see a number of factors that led to the differences between the two countries, are costing the business a lot. The sovereign risk, especially in Zimbabwe, is so high that even to attract credit lines across the world, it can just be a hard, slow, difficult slog to achieve.
Indeed. We'll leave it there for the time being. Thank you very much for your time, sir. We appreciate that. We've been speaking to the CEO, of course, of the Zimbabwean Chamber of Commerce live in Harare.